The Time Machine wasn't just another sci-fi remake. It had 3 directors, a deleted September 11th scene, a broken rib, and the great-great-grandson of H.G. Wells behind the camera. Here are 15 facts you never knew. 15. The rights required 2 competing studios to co-produce the legal architecture behind the Time Machine. 2002 was unusual enough to deserve its own story. Producer Arnold Leibovit had spent years acquiring the rights to the 1960 George Pal film adaptation of the novel, not the novel itself, which was in the public domain, but the specific 1960 film. That meant any new production wanting to use elements from the Pal version, which included significant creative elements that carried over into the remake, had to deal with Leibovit directly. The result was a co-production arrangement between DreamWorks and Warner Brothers that was brokered specifically because both studios needed Leibovit's rights to proceed. 2 competing studios with different cultures, different release strategies, and different priorities were legally required to make the same film together. DreamWorks handled North American distribution. Warner Brothers handled international. A story about a man who couldn't control time was made by 2 companies that couldn't agree on a budget without a legal agreement binding them to the same machine. 14. Steven Spielberg was set to direct it first. The first director attached to the Time Machine. 2002 was Steven Spielberg. The project had been set up at DreamWorks, his studio, and in the late 1990s it was positioned as a Spielberg production in the truest sense. Not just a studio release, but a film he would personally direct. He moved on to other projects before production began, and the role passed to Brad Silberling, the director of Casper and City of Angels. Silberling lasted longer than Spielberg, but ultimately departed over creative differences with the producers. Then Simon Wells came in. 3 directors had now been attached to a film that hadn't yet started principal photography. When Wells pitched himself, he went to DreamWorks' Jeffrey Katzenberg and said plainly he really ought to be directing this because of the name. He meant his great-great-grandfather. Katzenberg agreed. A film that had been gestating since the 1980s finally had a director with the most obvious qualification in the history of the project, a family connection to the man who wrote it. 13. The director was the great-grandson of H.G. Wells. Simon Wells was not a famous director when he took on the Time Machine. He was an animator, one of the key creative figures behind The Prince of Egypt and An American Tail. Fievel Goes West, both produced under Spielberg's DreamWorks banner. He had never directed a live-action film. What he had was a name. His great-great-grandfather was H.G. Wells, the man who wrote The Time Machine in 1895. The producers recognized that his animation background was genuinely useful. The film required enormous amounts of visual effects work and an animator's understanding of movement, staging, and digital environments would translate directly to the demands of the production. Wells himself later admitted that The Time Machine was a really tough film, that the exhaustion he eventually suffered wasn't a surprise given what the production required. He had come to the project carrying the weight of his family's legacy on a story his ancestor had invented. That is a specific kind of pressure that no other director in Hollywood could have fully understood. 12. Gore Verbinski finished the last 18 days without credits. 18 days before principal photography wrapped, Simon Wells collapsed from exhaustion. The production had pushed him past the point where he could continue functioning. The studio brought in a replacement director to get the film over the finish line, Gore Verbinski, who had made The Mexican with Brad Pitt and Julia Roberts earlier that year, and would go on to direct Pirates of the Caribbean. Verbinski stepped in, shot the remaining 18 days, and received no directing credit on the finished film. His name does not appear anywhere in the theatrical release. Wells returned for post-production and completed the editing, the visual effects, supervision, and the final cut. The film is officially a Simon Wells picture, but the last 18 days of its production were directed by the man who would later win an Oscar for Rango. A film that had already gone through Spielberg and Silberling before Wells got it was finished by a 4th director. The Time Machine had more hands on it than the prop itself. 11. Samantha Mumba was cast from a magazine photo. Samantha Mumba was not discovered through a conventional audition process. In 2000, the Irish pop singer, whose debut single Gotta Tell You had been a major international hit appeared in a People magazine article. A DreamWorks casting agent saw the article, contacted her manager, and offered her a screen test. There was no open call, no agent submission, no tape. A talent agent spotted her face in a celebrity magazine and made a phone call. Mumba had never appeared in a feature film. The casting of her as Mara, the Eloi woman at the center of the film's emotional core, bypassed the standard process entirely. Her brother, Omero Mumba, was also cast in the film as Mara's younger brother, Callan, making The Time Machine a family debut for both of them. Critics were divided on her performance, but generally acknowledged that she held her own against Pearce. She had been found in a magazine. She made her film debut opposite one of Australia's most respected actors. The casting agent had good eyes. 10. Guy Pearce broke a rib doing his own stunts. Guy Pearce performed most of his own stunts throughout The Time Machine. The production noted his consistency. His performances were so precise from take to take that audio from one take could be combined with video from another, and the two would match perfectly. That level of physical commitment carried a cost. During a sequence where Alexander tackles a Morlock from the side, Pearce hit the creature at the wrong angle. He broke a rib. Filming continued. In a 2024 GQ interview, Pearce described the production as one of the most difficult experiences of his career, not because of the physical demands, but because of the institutional dynamics around them. He described feeling as though his instincts were irrelevant, that executives above the creative process were making decisions that he was not part of, and that the disconnect between what he was trying to do and what the production wanted from him was a fundamental source of frustration throughout the shoot. He broke a rib for a film he was already struggling to believe in. That takes a specific kind of professionalism. 9. A September 11th scene was cut before release. The Time Machine was originally scheduled for release in December 2001. That date was moved to March 2002 for two reasons, one competitive, one historical. The competitive reason was The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, which had just opened and was dominating the box office with no sign of slowing down. The historical reason was September 11th. The film contained a sequence in which the moon's destruction sends debris crashing into the skyline of New York City. Buildings were shown being struck by falling chunks of the moon, collapsing under the impact. The imagery was considered too visually close to the footage of the World Trade Center attacks that had been broadcast globally just months earlier. The sequence was cut before release. A film set partly in New York City had to remove its most spectacular destruction sequence because reality had arrived first and made the fiction feel inappropriate. The film that opened in March 2002 was not quite the film that had been finished before November 2001. 8. The screenwriter also invented the Eloi language. John Logan, who wrote the screenplay for The Time Machine and served as a co-producer, did not stop at writing dialogue for the English-speaking characters. He invented an entire language for the Eloi. In the far future of 802,701, the Eloi do not speak English. They have their own language, their own syntax, their own vocabulary. Logan constructed that language from scratch, building the phonetics, the grammar, and the word forms that a people living on Cliff faces 800,000 years in the future might plausibly have developed. The cast members playing Eloi learned their lines phonetically, working with Logan's constructed language to make the scenes feel genuinely foreign rather than vaguely exotic. Logan went on to write Gladiator, The Aviator, Skyfall, and Spectre. His entry in the Time Machine's production history is listed simply as writer. The constructed language that an audience of millions heard spoken on screen doesn't get its own credit. It was built by the same man who wrote the English scenes in the gaps between drafts. 7. The Über-Morlock was played by Jeremy Irons in motion capture. Jeremy Irons did not simply voice the Über-Morlock, he performed the role through motion capture. His movements and physical performance captured digitally and used to animate the creature on screen. The Über-Morlock was conceived as the intellectual apex of the Morlock civilization, a telepathic ruling caste member whose calm menace came from intelligence rather than physical threat. The producers wanted a performance that felt inhabited rather than purely animated, and Irons was recruited specifically to bring that weight. His vocal delivery gave the character a philosophical register that separated it from the creature effects surrounding it. Roger Ebert, who found much of the film unconvincing, singled out the iron scenes as the points where the film came closest to something genuinely interesting. A creature role normally associated with makeup, prosthetics, and physical performance was approached as an acting problem. Irons solved it the way he solves every acting problem, by making the character feel like he knows things the audience doesn't. 6. The 33-second CGI shot was the film's most ambitious visual, the most technically demanding shot in the time machine. Is 33 seconds long. It begins in the workshop where Alexander's time machine is located, then pulls back through the walls of the building, rises above New York City, continues upward through the atmosphere into space, passes the International Space Station, and ends on the surface of the moon, where a future lunar colony is being established by humanity. The entire sequence was computer-generated by industrial light and magic. Not enhanced, generated entirely. Every building, every street, every cloud layer, every star field was a digital construction. The shot was designed to communicate the compression of time and the expansion of human ambition in a single unbroken movement. It was ILM's most complex single-shot contribution to the film and remains one of the more technically impressive CGI sequences produced before the dominance of photorealistic rendering. 33 seconds, no cuts, from a workshop in 1899 New York to the surface of the moon. It works better than most of the film around it. 5. Stan Winston built the Morlock suits, and ILM built the running ones. The Morlocks in the Time Machine were a split production between two of Hollywood's most respected effects houses. Stan Winston's studio built the physical suits, full animatronic masks worn by actors with detailed creature faces capable of expression and movement. For scenes where Morlocks are standing, threatening, or interacting at close range with human characters, the Winston suits were used. Then the Morlocks started running. For the sequences where Morlocks sprint on all fours at speeds no human in a suit could achieve, Industrial Light and Magic built entirely CGI versions of the same creatures. The transition between practical and digital Morlock was the film's most visible effects challenge. Roger Ebert specifically criticized the running sequences as cartoonish, noting that the moment the creatures broke into full speed, the believability broke with them. Stan Winston's suits were convincing. ILM's running Morlocks were not. The film spent its budget on both approaches and found that the scene between them was exactly where the audience looked. 4. The time machine prop was built by Stan Winston. Stan Winston's studio was responsible not just for the creature work, but for the physical time machine itself. The prop was built with intricate mechanical detail, gears, levers, spinning components, and materials that suggested Victorian engineering pushed past its natural limits. It weighed significantly enough that handling it on set required careful logistics and specialized rigging. The machine was designed to feel functional rather than decorative, a device that a real engineer of 1899 might plausibly have built if he had access to materials slightly beyond his time. The prop earned considerable praise from reviewers who were otherwise unmoved by the film's second half. The Houston Chronicle noted that the film was most transporting when it stayed in the past, and the time machine itself was a significant reason for that response. It was the most convincing object in the film. More convincing, some argued, than several of the digital environments built around it. 3. Guy Pearce was so consistent. The audio from one take matched video from another guy. Pearce's performance in the time machine generated a specific observation from the production team that has remained attached to the film ever since. His line deliveries, his physical positions, his timing, all of it was so consistent from take to take that the editing team could lift the audio track from one take and lay it under the video of a different take, and the two would match perfectly. The sync was exact. The breath, the emphasis, the slight movement of his head all reproduced precisely enough to be interchangeable. It is an unusual technical distinction for an actor to earn, and it speaks to a level of physical and vocal control that most performers never develop. Pearce later described the production as frustrating at an institutional level, feeling that his instincts were dismissed by executives who weren't in the room while he was working. That frustration doesn't appear in the footage. What appears in the footage is a performance so technically precise that the editors could build it like a puzzle. Mixing takes freely because Pearce never changed. 2. A picture of H.G. Wells hangs in Alexander's house. Several shots throughout the film's 1899 New York sequences show the interior of Alexander's home and laboratory. In multiple of those shots, visible in the background on the wall is a framed photograph of H.G. Wells. It is not called attention to, no character references it, the camera does not linger on it. It simply hangs there, the author of the original novel appearing in his own story, watching the character inspired by his imagination live in a house that has been built to honor the world he created. Simon Wells placed it there deliberately. A great-great-grandson directing an adaptation of his ancestor's work put a photograph of that ancestor on the wall of the set and let it exist quietly. 1. Alan Young found the same shirt he wore 42 years earlier. Alan Young played David Philby in the 1960 Time Machine, the loyal friend who watches George depart and is left behind at the end of the film. 42 years later, he returned to the franchise for a cameo in the 2002 version, appearing as a florist in the 1899 New York sequences. When Young arrived on set to pick his costume, he went through the rack of period shirts the costume department had assembled. He found one he liked, he put it on. Then he looked at the collar. Written inside was his own name. It was the same shirt he had worn as Philby in the 1960 film. Brought from wherever it had been stored across 4 decades, hanging in a rack on a different studio set waiting. Nobody had planned it. The costume department had not selected it for him. He had simply reached for a shirt that fit, and the shirt turned out to belong to him already. A man who had watched a time traveler leave in 1960 came back in 2002, reached into a rack of old clothes and pulled out a piece of 1960. Some things follow you no matter how far you travel. A film that passed through 4 directors, 2 studios, 1 broken rib, and a deleted skyline sequence, and still managed to hide its best story inside a costume rack. Which fact hit you hardest? Drop it in the comments. Subscribe for more deep dives into the sci-fi films that came unstuck in time before they even opened. Until next time.